Hello, Connect Church. After we wrapped up our He Made Them series, or at least the first portion of it, I answered many of the questions that you had sent in to me regarding transgenderism, ideologies, and their relation to the scripture and the way that these things play themselves out in our workplaces and schools and all those different things. But you guys actually sent in more questions than I was able to answer in last Sunday's sermon. And so I wanted to take a few minutes today and do my best to address the questions that you sent to me that I haven't answered just yet. So why don't we start with this one? There was someone in our church that said, is there ever a time and a place for Christians to protest? You said in your first sermon, Dan, that Christians shouldn't be in parades or protesting or anything, but is there ever a time if there are unhealthy ideologies that are being pushed in our world? Should we just accept them? I thought I was clear maybe in that first message that it's not so much that there's never a time to protest or to push back, but how we push back and how we protest is just as important as what we protest over. And so I want to remind you guys to keep a Christlike posture in what you say. If you're writing an email to the city council or the school board, or if you're going to a protest or something like that, what are the words that you're using? What's the posture that you're carrying and showing to the world? Is it Christ-like? I think that although there is a time and a place for us to take a stand against unhealthy or unhelpful ideologies and philosophies, the way that we do it is going to be critically important. And so we want to represent Christ even as we push back against what we think, we shouldn't be accepting of as believers in the world. A lot of this comes down to the fact that we really shouldn't be surprised when the world acts in worldly ways. Like the scriptures are pretty clear that non-Christians really aren't going to act like Christians because acting like Christ is a work of the Holy Spirit. Let me read for you something the Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter number 5. He wrote, starting in verse number 9, when I wrote to you, he's talking to the Corinthian believers, when I wrote to you before, I told you not to associate with people who indulge in sexual sin. But I wasn't talking about unbelievers who indulge in sexual sin or are greedy or treat people or worship idols. You would have to leave this world to avoid people like that. No, I meant that you are not to associate with anyone who claims to be a believer yet indulges in these sorts of sins. Don't even have dinner with such a person. It's not my responsibility to judge outsiders, but it certainly is your responsibility to judge those inside the church who are sinning. God will judge those on the outside, but as the scriptures say, you must remove the evil from among you. The world can do what it wants to, right? If there's a male out there and he wants to be known as a female, dress as a female, that's his choice. We live in a free society and he can do what he wants to on his own. Ultimately, everybody will answer to God. And so a Christian's responsibility is not to judge or critique the outside world for not acting like Christ, because we shouldn't expect them to. Instead, our job is to make sure that we are imitating Christ in everything that we do. Now, I do believe that Christians have a responsibility to push back against these unhealthy, ideologies and philosophies and things like that, particularly when it comes to children. I was having a conversation with a dad in our church this past Sunday. We were in the lobby and he said, I'm concerned about my kids learning all of these things that obviously I disagree with and I think are unbiblical. And so he said, my wife and I, we made the decision to opt our kids from the health and sexuality curriculum at their public school. And I had to tell him that although that is an option and your kids will avoid some things that you might not want them to hear, gender ideology is actually not considered a part of the health curriculum or fully a part or solely a part of the health curriculum in Alberta. Instead, it's taught more in the sense of human rights and sociology and psychology and things like that. And so what that means is even if you opt your kids out of the sex ed curriculum, they're still going to be getting the gender ideology teaching that we've talked about throughout this series. And so, if things continue on the same trajectory that they're headed on now, I do believe that Christian parents will have to make some very difficult decisions when it comes to schooling. It might be that Christian school or homeschooling becomes the most attractive option because the school system refuses to engage with parents who might have qualms and concerns about what their kids are teaching. Regardless of whether your kids stay in public school, go to Christian school, do homeschooling, or anything like that, it's not merely enough to protest and lament the things that are going on in our world. Instead, as a parent, you've got to actively teach your children. If you want them to know a better understanding of gender and self-image and identity, then you've got to be the one that teaches them. It's not up to the church alone. It's certainly not up to the school system. And if we leave it to media and social media, they're going to get really bad ideas. So as a parent, I challenge you and encourage you to be actively engaged in talking through these issues with your children from a young age and helping them to understand and have a biblical foundation for what it means to be a specially beloved creation of God. Now, another question that was sent in regards something I said in one of my messages. The question is this: Dan, you mentioned in one of your messages that there's been a nearly complete reversal between trans identification in boys and in girls. Can you elaborate more on this? Yeah, I'm glad to. I did mention that in one message, and it's based on very solid and well accepted research. 20 to 30 years ago, the vast majority, in fact, almost the entirety of those who were presenting for treatment for gender dysphoria, right? Almost everybody that was saying, going to a doctor, psychologist, psychiatrist, whatever, and saying, man, there's something off about me. What do I need to do? The vast majority of them 20 to 30 years ago were preschool boys. Nearly entirely, it was young boys who were claiming they were female, born in the wrong body kind of thing, and parents were bringing them to counselors saying, what is this and what do we do? Today, the vast majority of people that are presenting for gender dysphoria treatment are teenage girls. In fact, the studies show anywhere from 70 to 80% of anyone who goes to a doctor because they feel an inner disconnect between their sense of self and their physical body, 70 to 80% of them are teenage girls. There was another study that was done in the UK that showed very, very similar results. Girls present for gender affirming care 4 to 5 times as often as boys do in 2023. What drives that? Like, how do we go from having primarily very young boys saying they're in the wrong body to now having the vast majority being teenage girls saying they're in the wrong body? One of the things that we know is that there are certain psychological and sociological phenomenon that disproportionately affect females. That for whatever reason, and there are probably a lot of them, girls are more likely to be impacted. So eating disorders, cutting, and other forms of self-harm, suicide attempts. I didn't know this until recently. Teenage girls are 3 to 9 times more likely to attempt suicide than teenage boys, which is wild and very sad. Teenage boys are more likely to be successful in their suicide attempts, but girls attempt suicide far more often. And there is growing understanding that gender dysphoria is impacting teenage girls in a way that is maybe outsized to the what like the demographics might suggest. There's a phrase that's called rapid onset gender dysphoria, and ROGD basically says that teenage girls are saying that they are trans, born in the wrong body, or they no longer want to identify as female, despite the fact that previously in their life they've never experienced any sort of gender dysphoria. One of the requirements for being diagnosed as gender dysphoric, according to the DSM, is that you have to have had a long-term ongoing sense of being in the wrong body. Like since you were a kid, you have to know or feel that you were in the wrong body. And yet the majority of teenage girls that are presenting today actually haven't had that long-term experience. It's something that came up very quickly and very suddenly. Now they know that, and so in various online forums and on social media and things like that, girls are often coached on the right things to say in order to receive the diagnosis that they need. so that they can get the care that they believe will help them. And so this rapid onset gender dysphoria, it's controversial for sure. There are many people that, they don't believe in it, or they believe that it's harmful or something like that. But it does explain the realities that the vast majority of people that are presenting for gender care these days are teenage girls that have never had any history of gender dysphoria. Now, what causes all this? Like, I don't claim to have the answers, you guys. I really don't. But I do ask the question, what has made our girls hate themselves so much? Like, why is it a bad thing to be a female in so many females' eyes? Something has given them the impression that being a girl is an undesirable thing. This is a super real problem. We can trace it back certainly to social media and the unrealistic expectations that it places on everyone, but particularly girls. I think the Me Too movement has a great deal of, it is partially at least and potentially significantly responsible for girls saying, being a female is a dangerous thing. It is a vulnerable thing. And there can be a sense in which femininity is something that girls don't want to identify with, because society sets a picture of that is so unattainable. They feel bad because they're nowhere close to this standard. And they see more and more that women are abused and taken advantage of physically, emotionally, sexually in our world today. And so it's entirely possible that they simply don't feel safe being female. Again, I'm certain there's so much more to this, but I think the fact that the majority of people presenting with gender dysphoria are teenage girls is something that really needs to be researched, and we need to think about the implications of what that might mean and what it might be teaching us about our world today. Another question that a parent sent in, I've got two more for you. Another question that was sent in is the question, what if my kid starts to claim to be transgender? Maybe they come home from school and they start saying they're in the wrong body, or, they may come out and make a strong stand, or maybe they're just hinting that perhaps they might, how do you handle that as a Christian parent? And I think the answer really depends, okay? It depends on how old your child actually is. If they are prepubescent, meaning preschool to elementary age, it's almost always best to do nothing. If your little boy comes home and he starts saying he's a girl, you may want to freak out. You may kind of think about like all of the gender identity stuff that's going on in our world today, and you may want to just try to squash it as quickly and thoroughly as you possibly can. But I don't really think that that's a great solution. And the reason why is that all of the research we have, all of the research shows that in prepubescent kids, 70 to 88%, depending on the study that you're looking at, 70 to 88% of gender dysphoria in children will resolve itself before adulthood if we do nothing. It's kind of one of those things that pops up and it's there for a season or a time in a kid's life, but for the vast majority, 70 to 88% of it, it'll all go away without us doing anything to intervene or to redirect any of it. And so I think, one of the worst things a parent can do if it's a young kid is, maybe you've got a girl and she's saying, I think I'm a boy. I don't like girly things. I'm a boy. I'm a boy. As a parent, you may want to say, no, silly, you're a girl. God made you a girl. Here, I'm going to put you in a dress and make you wear pink, and it's going to be frilly, and we're going to really show you this is the sort of person and that you're supposed to be and the things that you're supposed to be focused on. But what that actually does is it teaches your little girl to hate feminine things, right? Because she wants to identify, or she wants to play with monster trucks, or, wear shorts instead of dresses, or whatever the case may be. And in her mind, for whatever reason, wherever she's gotten this sort of idea from, she thinks that makes her a boy. If you keep forcing her into things that are stereotypically girl or feminine things, she's going to hate them, and she's going to hate feminine things or female things even more. And so what will happen is unintentionally, you'll risk pushing her further away from her God-given identity, her natural biological sex. So if it's a young kid, prepubescent, you probably ought to just let it ride, have lots of conversations. don't freak out. The absolute likelihood is that that kid is going to have all of this kind of just resolve and disappear on its own without you needing to do anything, all right? If it's a teenager or a pubescent, post-pubescent kid that says that they are trans, then you may have to be a little bit more direct. We really don't have as much long-term research that shows whether or not direct interventions trying to align a kid's gender identity with their biological sex is helpful, or if just leaving it alone and ignoring it is the best, or kind of supporting maybe small forms of social transitioning but not others is best. We don't have that data yet because this is such a relatively new phenomenon. But here's what we do know. In kids that are trans-identifying, or sorry, in teenagers that are trans-identifying, there are much, much higher rates of co-occurring mental health issues than there are with the general population, and certainly over young kids that are assuming or hinting at a trans identity. And so I would suggest that, like, if your kid is also suffering from depression or an eating disorder or self-harm or anxiety or something like that, help them to address that component of their mental health and their being, and that actually might help alleviate some of the other distresses that they're feeling in their life. Here's what you have to know as a parent, and this might be surprising to some of you. Every other person in any sort of authority position in a teenager's life is required by law and policy, essentially at this point, to be gender affirming. Meaning, if a kid comes and says, I am trans, I'm in the wrong body, I don't feel like myself, they just have to say yes. Like, they're not allowed to ask questions, they're not allowed to redirect, they're not allowed to suggest that anything other than transitioning or alignment is a valid path forward. And that means that you as a parent are really the only person that will be potentially offering a contrary perspective to what they're getting from everyone else. That does put you in a difficult spot because it's very easy then to be labeled as backwards or hateful or a transphobe or whatever the case may be. But I think as parents, there is this obligation to speak what you believe to be true in loving ways to your kids, particularly when you know that they're not getting it from anywhere else. And so if you have a teenage child that is identifying as trans, I would start just by asking lots of questions. So my first response would be love. I love you no matter what. You're always welcome in this home. Your dad and I, your mom and I, your family and I, we're all here for you, and we want to understand. And so I would start by asking lots and lots of questions. Don't tell them, ask them. Don't tell them what you think, ask them why they are feeling this way. Maybe a good example could be the difference between these two questions. Maybe you're frustrated and you're taken aback when your kid comes home and says that they are transgender. You might ask a question that goes something like, what happens when this phase passes and you don't want to be trans anymore, right? That question, although it is a valid question, it's presented in such a way that is almost always going to create barriers. And so instead, maybe a healthier and more effective and fruitful question to ask is, do you ever worry about crossing a line in transitioning that you can't return from? They're basically the same question, right? Like, are you ever afraid that some of these decisions that you make are ones that you can't come back from if you ever were to change your mind? The first question assumes they will change their mind. This is just a phase, they're wrong, and they're always going to react in a very kind of defensive way to that. So asking rather than telling, and asking well instead of asking kind of these very confrontational questions, I think can be a very a good place to start for sure. A lot of times, the identification as transgender is rooted, or at least it has some roots in past trauma. It could have roots in low self-esteem. I think it nearly always has roots in social media influence and friends or peer circles. And so I would be digging into those sorts of things. Has your kid experienced any of that? What are their friend circles like? What have they been consuming on social media? Because all of that forms an influence that you might not even be aware of that is helping to shape and orient your kid in this direction. The last thing I'll say on that, on this particular issue or question is this: like, as a Christian, your primary job is to communicate love and kindness to your child. We talked about this in week 1. No matter what you believe to be right or true, we want to communicate Christ-like love and kindness. And so, in whatever you do, in whatever questions you ask, and whatever path forward you might take, are you communicating? Are you reflecting the love of God? How are you doing that? Do your kids believe that you love them? Are you doing everything in your can to make sure that they know that you do? I think if you can do that, that will at least lay a foundation for healthy conversations to occur in the weeks, months, and even years to come. Okay, last question that somebody sent in, and I'm just going to read the question itself because I think it really, the question itself actually captures a lot of emotion, okay? The question says this: with the current trajectory of society, politics, culture, public opinion, and the education system as it relates to sexual orientation, gender identity over the last 20 years, I'm honestly quite discouraged and losing hope. Raising children in this hostile, hedonistic social environment terrifies me. So what can I do to elevate my spirit? Is there reason to be more optimistic? Now, the good news is I actually think there is some reason for optimism, maybe some clues or some evidence that our current obsession with gender identity theory might be waning or changing just a little bit. Now, in truth, gender identity theory and this concept of, like, an internal sense of gender, transgenderism, pangenderism, non-binary, all of that is going to be with us to one degree or another moving forward. There's no doubt about that. But I think there are, again, some things happening within the society at large that are maybe indicative of the fact that this is an obsession that is waning or tailing off. One interesting story I can point to in support of this is the Tavistock Centre in the UK, I believe in London. And the Tavistock Center was, or has been, kind of the primary gender-affirming care clinic worldwide, really. They pioneered a lot of the treatments and things that transgender and gender dysphoric people have been receiving. Those same treatments that were started there have become standard practice in other centers around the world. But just last year, the UK's health governmental organization said that they were closing down the Tavistock Center. And the reason they were closing down the Tavistock Center is there was an internal fracture inside of it with the doctors that were providing gender-affirming care. So gender-affirming care is the idea that when somebody shows up and says that they are gender dysphoric, they're transgender, they're in the wrong body, that doctors and other authority figures have the responsibility to affirm what the patient is telling them. They're not allowed to question it. They're not allowed to deny it. They're not allowed to downplay it. The procedures, the policies here are, if they say they have gender dysphoria, then they have gender dysphoria. And there really is no, pushback that's allowed. But what the doctors at the Tavistock Center started to notice was that many of the clients that were coming in, again, the majority of them were teenage girls, many of those that were coming in had significant other mental health distresses and disorders that were going on. And the doctors started to say, maybe it's not a great idea to immediately start to work with them on transitioning their gender without first dealing with their depression or their anxiety or their eating disorder or their self-harm or whatever other coexisting morbidities there might have been. And so they began to push back, and it led to a huge debate, very polarizing, very toxic, and eventually a bunch of the doctors kind of just said, we're not going to do this gender-affirming care model anymore without more robust mental health care for these people that need to transition. And so As a result, they actually announced the closure of the Tavistock Center. Many of the doctors, nurses, and administrators within that hospital have gone on the record, and they've expressed their concern over the politicization of the medical care of gender dysphoric people, and how the idea that we should always push them towards transition as the only thing, the only solution and treatment for them, particularly with young kids, is maybe unhealthy and very potentially dangerous. And so that's one example. I think we're going to start to see more of that. I wouldn't be surprised if in 20 or 30 years we don't look back and we say, man, do you remember when transgenderism was like the only thing the world really seemed to be concerned about? It was like every kid was identifying as trans or LGBTQ. I read a study, or a statistic rather, recently that said that in Gen Z, okay, the youngest age kids kind of that we have right now, that 1 in 5 Gen Z kids identifies as being a part of the LGBTQ community. 20%, that number is massively inflated over what our current understanding of the number of transgender and gay, lesbian, bisexual people should be. That percentage of the population is massively inflated. For Gen X, the generation that I'm a part of, that number was 1 in 20. So, 5%. Now it's jumped all the way to 20%. I don't think it likely that we'll continue to see 30, 40, 50% of people identify as a part of the LGBTQ community. Instead, what I think we'll see is that many people are identifying in this marginalized community because it gives them a strong sense of identity. It gives them a sense that they belong to a class, or they have qualities and characteristics that explain, some of the things that they've been feeling. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see some of that tail off a little bit. Again, as Christians, our job is not to follow the trajectory and track of whatever is trendy or happens to be the issue du jour in our world today, but instead we continue to look to the Scripture to give us our sense of what is true and right, what is good and noble, and what we should be pursuing in the posture that we should be presenting to the rest of the world. I want to say thanks so much for taking the time to send your questions in, and for many of you who disagree with me on this particular issue, even within our church, you've all been so gracious to me, and I'm thankful for that. I hope that you have sensed my graciousness and love towards you, even if we don't agree on this issue. I think all of us are doing our best to seek the Lord and to honor him and in what we believe and how we live in the world today. And if we can get ourselves to continue to have that sort of open posture and perspective, then that will be really, really helpful and productive for this conversation and many more that are to come. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in and for sending in your questions. I hope you have an amazing week.